it was still full of like, native peoples that we were conquering and displacing in order to take their land and the resources on that land. So it was kind of imperialistic, but we could sort of get away with it not technically being imperialistic. However, by the end of the 19th century, there was this economic and cultural push for America to actually properly become imperialistic, to really assert itself on the imperialist stage. And boy, it did. In the course of just 6 years, the United States had acquired Guam, Hawaii, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico, established a protectorate in Cuba. We'll get to that. Used force to build a canal in Panama, and then further intervened in Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. So, yeah, we went from, well, in fact, this next picture shows it very well. In 1798, the United States was from the Mississippi to the Atlantic Ocean, and by 1898, from Manila, which is the Philippines, to Puerto Rico. And those were definitely imperialistic gains. These are islands well beyond any kind of jurisdiction we could claim. And they were simply being used for resource and economic gain rather than any kind of settlement or whatever you could explain away for the movement west. Here we have a lovely image from Puck. So you have here at the bottom, school begins, Uncle Sam in his new class in civilization. Now children, you've got to learn the lessons whether you want to or not, but just take a look at the class ahead of you and remember that in a little while you will feel glad to be here, feel as glad to be here as they are. So you see there in the back, the students that are the states, those in the front, because that's how schools were set up, is you just had the younger students in the front. The territories that were taken by force, technically Cuba wouldn't be there, but they sort of were there. You see African Americans still being just put to work rather than being put in school. Native Americans not really being included, and we're still including the Chinese not even being let in the building. So got a little bit of everything here. This is actually a really on-point image from Puck Magazine. We've got a little bit of everything. And then there's all sorts of just other stuff throughout the image that if you just want to look at it in greater detail, it's just all sorts of stuff. This was like this was like a centerfold image. It was, real big. Here's the front page, or like a cover image for Puck Magazine. Columbia's Easter bonnet, world power, Navy, Army, and then expansionism there. Again, Columbia being the personification of America. And here's the other personification of America, Uncle Sam. This one includes the Canary Islands. That was a very brief imperial claim. That one didn't last terribly long. That was very far to the east. And that was claimed by like Spain and Portugal. And were there other countries that claimed the Canary Islands? There was a bunch of countries that claimed the Canary Islands over hundreds of years. So yeah, I don't know why we were involved there for any amount of time. Here's McKinley starting work on the Panama Canal. Obviously, he didn't finish it because he wasn't in office very long. But we will talk about Teddy Roosevelt finishing this. This is an interesting one. A lesson for anti-expansionists, showing how Uncle Sam has been an expansionist first, last, and all the time. Because people were complaining that, America shouldn't be expansionist. We were colonies, and we're supposed to be anti-colonial, anti-expansionist. But showing that over the period of time, we started with 13 states and gradually expanded. And now as we get larger and stronger, the other countries are friendlier to us because we're now a world player. There again is Columbia and the terrifying Teddy Roosevelt battleship there. We'll talk about the Great White Fleet. Speaking of Teddy Roosevelt, the new diplomacy. We're having issues with Mexico. We'll get to that. Also, this is a real good map because we largely talk about the Mediterranean for most of this. So we talk about Cuba, talk about Nicaragua and Panama a little bit. Puerto Rico, a very small amount. But when we get into I should probably use a mouse since we are doing online here. When we talk about Hawaii, and then we get all the way over here to the Philippines, or Manila, which is the capital, but the Philippines here. That's right under China. I mean, that's way over here. And when you see just the absolute distance we're talking about, that is definitely some serious expansion in terms of distance. This isn't just, it's right here. You're just going a little bit. You're going across the mountains, or you're going across the river. You're just expanding further west. It's way out here. This is at least sort of in our backyard. I don't even remember the reasoning for Alaska, because that's way up here. But yeah, there were some major imperialistic claims for that. All right, so let's get into the reasons for all of this. Obviously, money was a big one. Of course, it's going to be money. So, early on, the U.S. mostly exported agricultural products because, we were a big agrarian country. Pretty plain and simple there. By the end of the 19th century, we had been industrializing, so most of what we were pushing out were, industrial products, lots and lots of them. So not just were we doing less agricultural stuff, but there was just lots more products being pushed onto the market. So, for example, in 1870, our exports totaled about $500 million. By 1905, it was triple to $1.5 billion. So we had Rockefeller Standard Oil Company, Coca-Cola, Kodak, McCormick Reaper, all going to European and eventually Asian markets. And, this is the issue. So most of these products are going to developed markets, largely in Europe. But here's the thing is there's only so many people living in Europe, and also America. You can send this stuff to markets in your own country. But a farmer only needs one or two McCormick Reapers. I've got pictures of these in a minute. You know, you can only use so much oil in a lifetime. You can only drink so much Coca-Cola. Basically, they literally ran out of people to sell stuff to. I mean, in fact, there was that was literally an episode of Jimmy Neutron back in the day. Is everybody had a car, and Jimmy's dad lost his job because his job was to sell cars to people in their little town, and everybody had a car, and there were no people to buy cars anymore. And so the businessmen, particularly, this is specifically for America, but it's the exact same in Europe, which for my 104 class, we'll talk about that when we get to the imperialism chapter, which is coming right up. They wanted to open markets in Asia and Latin America, and especially China, because they had huge populations, and hey, lots of people, lots of market. To use a specific example, we had Hawaii. So Hawaii was this chain of islands. I mean, it is this chain of islands out in the Pacific. And at the time, it was, ruled by a monarchy, Queen Liliuokalani, and we have been sending missionaries there since, the 1920s? 1820s. Okay, 1920s. I'm in the wrong century again. The 1820s. So the missionaries are trying to convert the natives, and white businessmen were exploiting the sugarcane market because we've already talked about how important sugarcane is. I think we talked about it this semester. We really talked about it last semester. In 1893, white plantation owners, along with the American ambassador and 150 Marines, overthrew the government because they just decided that that'd be an easier way to make money, is just to take control of the entire government. Why not? So they tried to immediately have their new, I guess you'd call it a state. I mean, it's any kind of government entity's technically a state. They tried to have Hawaii annexed into the United States, but this was in 1893, and if you recall from like 2 chapters ago, 1893 was a bad time. Grover Cleveland denied them because he was too busy screwing everything else up. So they just stayed in power and waited until a different president would allow the annexation. So yeah, this is how a lot of this happened. Was we had like white businessmen who were controlling a large portion of the market, had a lot of money, and American military in the region, and they decided, you know what, let's just overthrow the government, and they did. Like, that happened a lot. In fact, I'm honestly surprised Nicaragua isn't one of our states, or at least a territory, because we did that in Nicaragua. I guess Nicaragua fought back harder than Hawaii did, so they managed to kick the guys out before we could go in and properly invade. We did a lot of that. So here's Standard Oil, technically of New Jersey, so totally not a monopoly, you guys. Coca-Cola, delightful, palatable, and helpful beverage. This is when Coca-Cola was sort of a medicine, but also sort of a drink. It was a weird time. The 1800s were great. I love this image. There are no game laws for those who hunt with a Kodak. The rod or gun may be left out, but no nature lover omits a Kodak from his camp outfit. So yeah, there's hunting laws and fishing laws, and the game warden will whip you if you're hunting out of season. But if you're out there just taking pictures, you won't get in trouble. In fact, I've got a picture of an old compact Kodak camera. Not just compact. I think that cover is not waterproof, but at least water resistant. So that's pretty cool. This is what the old McCormick Reapers look like. The horses would pull them. I mean, these are obviously sort of turned in a triangle, but they pull them and it would harvest the wheat and it go through the system and rather than having to bring it all back and like beat it in the barn to get the wheat from the chaff, it would just take care of that in the machine. So you would get clean wheat as you're harvesting it. It would take care of so much work. There's Queen Liliuokalani. All right, so besides money, there was also a cultural justification for all of this. So besides the money, there was also this racial argument. Americans and Western Europeans saw themselves as superior to those who had melanin in their skin, and thus had a natural right of conquest. So, all of that. However, to add some ethical considerations to it, because, they can't just say, well, we're better than them so we can do what we want. Because we've already seen from previous chapters there was some level of we can't just all be the bad guys and be okay with that consideration. So okay, well, yes, we're still, better than everybody else, but because of this, we have a duty to uplift these inferior people. So, for example, Hosea Strong in our country proclaimed the Anglo-Saxon race was superior and should spread the blessings of its Christian way of life all over the world. So I've actually got a little piece from his writing in the slideshow, so we'll get to that in a little bit. So as we saw with Hawaii, these later ventures had connection between these economic aspirations and missionary work. John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Cyrus McCormick created the World Student Christian Federation. Sent 5,000 missionaries all around the world. China was a major target. So first they would send missionaries who by 1920 were running schools, hospitals, orphanages, leper colonies, churches, and seminaries to convert these backward Chinese to the Christian way of life. And thus, they would want to consume American products, thus opening the market for American goods. And I know it's like, it takes a second to make that connection, but if they're not just converting them to basic biblical Christianity, but a very specific American form of Christianity, and converting them to a westernizing culture so that they will be more receptive to Americanizing Western goods and ideals. So here we have Josiah Strong, or Hosea Strong, I'm not sure exactly how he pronounces the J there. Doesn't matter, he's dead. It's not necessary to argue for those whom I write that the two greatest needs of mankind, that all men may be lifted up into the light of the highest Christian civilization, are first pure spiritual Christianity, and second, civil liberty. It follows then that Anglo-Saxons, as the great representative of these two ideals, depository of the great blessings, sustains peculiar relations with the world's future, is divinely commissioned to be, in a peculiar sense, his brother's keeper. So here are the two things that I think are most important, and the Anglo-Saxons are the ones that can do that the best. Therefore, we should rule the world because it's for everybody's best interest. Anyway, here's, I think this might be Rockefeller Jr. and McCormick and a few of the other rich lads that put together the World Student Christian Federation. Here's some folks in Tokyo Bay. Here's some nuns. I'm not sure exactly where they are. This is a group, I believe, in China. And at a later point, when places like Japan and China outright banned Christianity, it wasn't due to wasn't really a religious issue, because the religions in Japan and China aren't super strict. The most Asian religions are respect your elders and don't screw up the land. It's a very simplistic reading of it. But that's usually where most of that falls. Buddhism is probably the most well-defined, and even that is be a decent person. It's not because Buddha isn't considered a deity. He's just the one what did it best. Be like Buddha, he did it the best. Most of it was because it was destroying their culture and traditions, because it was trying to make the people like the West, so that the West could come in and set up their own markets. It wasn't seen as a religion, it was seen as a Western cultural invasion. All right, on to the next bit. So there were certain gender anxieties. We already talked about Tarzan in previous chapters, because, oh no, we haven't had a good war in a while, and what are we going to do? As I said, following the Civil War, a lot of Americans were worried that the next generation would not have a chance to test and strengthen their manhood. My dudes, you had people who were alive during the Civil War. You should know how bad the war was. Why are you? No. What's wrong with you? We had the economic depression in the 1890s. Men were unable to support the families as they once had. This is often distilled in Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden. Civilized white man ought to take up the burden of spreading the light of civilization across the world. And The White Man's Burden is in the book, page 625. Depends on how one reads it, but I think it's supposed to, Kipling was a British man, and typically they have really sharp wit and sarcasm, and it seems like a lot of times they'll be sarcastic and people won't get it and be like, yeah, this is a great idea. He's like, no, I wasn't being serious. What's wrong with you? Like A Modest Proposal by, I don't remember who was the one that wrote it, but he was basically like, yeah, we should just let the Irish eat their kids. And a bunch of people in Parliament were like, yeah, that's a great idea. It's like, I wasn't being serious, you idiots. I'll just read the first stanza of the poem. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. That's just the start of the poem. It feels like he's recognizing that the imperialism is hurting both the people that they are conquering and the people that they're sending out to keep the conquered in their place. Because they're sending out troops. In fact, I'm thinking when we get to the Philippine War, we'll talk about that. But especially when it comes to European imperialism, a lot of soldiers died simply going to other parts of the world and just dying of disease. But obviously the natives got the worst of it because, well, imperialism. Also, women were becoming more important. We talked about various folks in the previous chapters. Now, women's suffrage hadn't happened yet. This only goes up to the end of World War I. But as women's suffrage is being argued more and more, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who we will talk about a fair few times in this chapter, he believed that women's suffrage would undermine military security because of women's unwillingness to use force. And as I said in my class yesterday, Mr. Mahan clearly hasn't met any women in my family. However, the biggest call came from a group known as jingoists. This is going to also be a big term for this chapter, hint, hint. They felt in order to reassert their manhood, men should engage in warfare across the world because, wow, you guys feeling okay? This is feeling like some real whiny online loser shit. Roosevelt and Mahan were both in agreement on this. Mahan saying, and this is the quote that to me defines jingoism. No, I'm not going to make you remember the quote, but this is just a good thing to remember for jingoism. No greater danger could befall civilization than the disappearance of warlike spirit, and I dare say war, among civilized men. There are too many barbarians still in this world. So he says that the biggest danger to civilization is the disappearance of war. So I think that, the whole idea of if you had one wish, what would it be? Oh, it would be world peace. I feel like that probably came about after World War II, after we saw the horrors of what mankind could unleash upon itself. But that's something that Mahan will be vehemently against. It's like, how could you not want war? And then we had the Naval Act of 1890, construction of additional battleships for the American fleet. And within 10 years, so by 1900, the U.S. fleet had gone up to 17 battleships and 6 cruisers. making it the third most powerful navy in the world, up from 12th in 1880. So while 17 battleships and 3 cruisers, especially today, doesn't sound like a whole lot, we went up from 12th to 3rd in like worldwide navy. That's pretty good. I think the first two were, the first one was definitely Britain before World War I. The second in 1900 would have been either Germany or maybe France. This was either, if this was before Germany's buildup, it'd have been France. If it was after, it definitely would be Germany, because Germany started building up their navy prior to World War I. And they were basically on par with Britain, which terrified Britain. Well, they were on par with Britain in like a battle. So we have Judge, which clearly was on a certain side of the white man's burden. You have Uncle Sam, and there up front is John Bull. That's the personification of Britain. Carrying their conquered territories on their back over the rocks of oppression, barbarism, ignorance, vice, etc., etc. You know, up towards civilization, totally not. Oh, and over slavery, yeah, totally not enslaving the people that they've conquered. Here's a better one. The white man's burden, where we instead have the colonized people being carried by their colonizers. This one includes the Kaiser for Germany and a very obvious Napoleon III there in the back, who was in charge of France after 1890, I believe. I always forget about this one. So here is, it's not super important, but I have to show it. This is an ad for Pears soap using the concept of the white man's burden to sell soap. The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Pears soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances. While amongst the cultured of all nations it holds the highest place, it is the ideal toilet soap. Toilet is that's just a colloquial term for the whole bathroom for like the British. So yeah, there's Pears soap using the white man's burden to sell their stuff. I do kind of like how the bathroom they're using here is clearly aboard a ship, because you've got like a porthole there. That's kind of neat. We'll get to this. America in its force if necessary in China. Yeah. We did a whole lot of force if necessary. I don't even remember why I included this. This is the main, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Supposedly, France was involved. I don't know. I don't remember where that came from. Oh, here's Roosevelt having a great time with his little navy in the Caribbean Sea. right, and also, if you get it, you get it. This isn't from the 1890s, but it's basically the 1890s. Thanks, Columbia. All right, on to Cuba. So, just punched the mic. Sorry about that, online folks. That should be okay. 1895, Cuban War for Independence erupted, centering around the concept of Cubanidad, or pride of nation. This is this idea of nationalism, something that really took off in Europe around the French Revolution, especially Napoleon, in which you're fighting for your nation rather than like a ruler or a royal line, which was a thing in Europe for hundreds of years. So Jose Marti, believed that liberation from Spain would give the peasants access to better land because, well, all the Spanish nobles had access to all the good land, so you kick them off and more people get better land. Also providing racial equality for the recently liberated Afro-Cuban population. Black Cubans like Antonio Maceo flocked to the rebellion and filled many of the high-ranking positions. So right away, the Cuban rebellion was a biracial coalition. The Cuban War for Independence was a biracial coalition against Spain. So it was the, I guess you say the Hispanic Cubans, the native Cubans, and the recently freed Afro-Cubans. Now, the rebels only had about 50,000 men, and that's not a lot for a war against one of the great powers of Europe. Now, lucky for them, the great power they were fighting was Spain, and Spain had been on the downturn for a while. And also lucky for them, they were fighting in Cuba, which is great for guerrilla warfare, and also full of tropical diseases, which most of the natives were immune to because they've lived there all their lives. The Spanish troops were not so immune to it. So despite the 50,000 rebels fighting about 200,000 Spanish troops, which, if you're not good at math, isn't a very good number disparity for the rebels, the disease took care of a lot of the Spanish troops. Also, when the Spanish government tried to crack down on the rebellion, which is to say doing war crimes on the Spanish population centers, it caused the rebellion to spread further, because of course it did. So in 1897, the Spanish government offered the rebels a series of reforms and also allow home rule. Home rule is something that Ireland fought for I was going to say years, I should say decades. It's basically what Canada has now, where they've got their own government, they've got their own prime minister, they've got their own currency, but they're still technically within the empire, they're still technically part of the British Empire. However, Cuba demanded full separation. They wanted Cuba Libre, total independence from Spain. And despite being outnumbered, they had been winning this war, or at least on the winning side of this war, for quite some time. As we said before, a full quarter of the Spanish troops fell ill with yellow fever, malaria, other tropical diseases. You know, it was bad times for the Spanish troops. This is another great quote. In fact, yeah, this is something I mentioned yesterday in my class. This was probably my favorite quote of the chapter. The chief military leader for the Cuban rebels, General Maximo Gomez, said his three best generals were Junio, Julio, and Augusto, which is to say June, July, and August, because that's when the rainy seasons rolled in and the disease carriers, which is to say the mosquitoes, were at their most active and spreading the illnesses among the Spanish the fastest. So June, July, and August is when the most Spanish were dying from disease, and his troops didn't really have to work that hard. Also, while the Spanish forces did have 200,000 troops, Cuba wasn't the only colony in revolt. Those 200,000 troops were in Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Africa. And while this was going on, anti-war sentiment was rising in Spain, and by 1898, Spanish troops mutinied in Havana, which is, you know, the main city, now the capital city of Cuba. So, again, not going so well for Spain. So here we have the Cuban forces riding down the Spanish. And here's an actual image. I like the caption there. Discontent and wanting to be independent led to the Cuban War of Independence. No way. Thank you for that. Thank you for that insight there. They were not happy and they wanted to be independent, therefore they had a war of independence. Here is, I believe, the Spanish surrendering at one of the bases. This is what we're about to get into. There was this idea among Americans that, since Cuba was right there just south of Florida, that we needed to get involved because while Spanish misrule was bad, if Cuba was left to rule itself, it would just become anarchy and would therefore be even worse than Spanish rule. Because, the Cubans are brown, so they can't rule themselves. We got to step in and do something. And we did have some folks there before we actually got involved in the war. Mostly reporters, which I'll get into in just a moment. So, let's get into that. So, it's 1898. The war has been going on for 3 years. Spain has already, come to the negotiation table, and the rebels are so sure of their victory that they've denied the Spanish at the negotiation table. And it's now that American policymakers are deciding we should intervene and aid the Cuban rebels in this war, mostly because we want to make sure that we have control over where Cuba goes after this war. Now, obviously, we can't just say that to the general population because they're not necessarily going to want to get on board with, we want to go in and take over Cuba, but not entirely, just control them like a puppet. So we made this a matter of American honor. We had William Randolph Hearst in the New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World competed to provide the most lurid coverage of Spanish atrocities. Reporters went to Cuba to cover every story they could find. If they couldn't find stories of atrocities, they would make them up. This became known as yellow journalism, and it sparked this jingoistic outrage against Spain. Does anybody in here know why it was called yellow journalism? This actually wasn't a racist term, despite it being in the 1890s. It was because they were putting these stories out so fast that they were just constantly running the printers, and it was cheaper just to get the paper. The cheapest paper was untreated paper, and the untreated paper was yellow. Because if you treat paper, you got to bleach it to make it white, and that costs money. So you just get the cheap-ass yellow paper and print it and put it on the newsstand. So when you go to the newsstand and you look at all the newspapers, and there's a stack of yellow, kind of real, you'd touch it and feel how cheap it is. That's the yellow journalism, because you know that like they just printed it as quickly as they could. So Hearst published a letter that supposedly had the Spanish minister in Washington calling McKinley weak, but the final straw was on February 15th, 1898. Battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 266 American sailors. Now, the New York World shouted the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," because, you know, make it rhyme so people can remember it. But here's the thing, Spain was already losing against the rebels, and it made no sense for them to like attack an American battleship in their harbor, which for one, why were we in their harbor? Oh yeah, we were blockading their harbor despite us not being involved in the war. So that didn't make a whole lot of sense. But yeah, so the ship blew up. And though we didn't do a whole lot of investigation on what happened, we just decided we were going to war, damn it. War proclamation specifically stated that Cuba ought to be independent, but only when pacified, which would lead to a whole lot of stuff we'll get into next time. But first, this is talking about the Philippines. We'll definitely talk about the Philippines next time as well. Maine sailors murdered by Spain. Spanish brute adds mutilation to murder. Right, the ship blew up. There wasn't like Spanish sailors eating them or something. There's Guam. Guam was also involved. We don't talk much about Guam. There's Pulitzer and Hearst fighting over who gets to start the war. They're wearing like baby dresses made out of the yellow material that the newspapers were made out of. Here's Uncle Sam cutting down the Spanish colonies tree. No longer will brutal Spain be supported by outraged colonies, but most of these colonies would go to America, so yeah. To hell with Spain, remember the Maine. Got that in the wrong order, but whatever. Here's the Maine exploding by artist rendition. There's Uncle Sam punching Spain in the mouth. Not the best place to punch somebody, but whatever. Okay. here is the remains of the Maine. So there were rumors that maybe it was like a torpedo or the Maine hit like an underwater mine. Further investigation showed that the explosion very likely came from the inside of the ship, very likely from the powder room where they kept the gunpowder for the cannons. So either it was a static discharge, which happened, or more likely, it was some dumbass smoking in the powder room, which happened very often. Well, I shouldn't say very often, but it happened more often than it should on ships like this. And it blew up from the inside because, it was full of explosives because it was a battleship. And, and we went to war with Spain over, because we just wanted to go to war with Spain, and this was a good excuse. It's weird how often that happens. Anyway, here's Spain again. Peace in Cuba under Spanish rule, worse than hell. I guess we'll get into the rest of the War of 1898 next time because there's so much time for class to end. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, we'll finish up the War of 1898 next time. I'll see you guys on Monday.